I am going to stage this convention, this conference, this meeting, this seminar, this weekend, on the subject of real history. And if some of you scratch your heads a bit when you see that phrase, real history, it basically is history written from the bedrock, history written with a clean nib, untainted, unpolluted by any kind of vested interests, history that is written from the archives, from the people, from the original wellsprings of where history came from. It's the kind of history that I like to propose I have always written myself. When I wrote my famous Adolf Hitler biography, Hitler's War, I went to very great trouble to track down Adolf Hitler's private staff, and over the 10 years that I wrote that book, persuade them to let me have their private diaries and letters and papers. And I went into the archives and read the telegrams, and I read the documents and the messages of the war years, and gradually became aware of this growing drumming on the window panes as all the other historians and writers said, yes, but what about our books? Aren't you going to consult them? And hearing this roar of indignation, as I said, no, I wouldn't dream of touching your books. I no longer need your books. I know what happened and why, which is what history is about. And if you wonder why I am now branded in the newspapers and the magazines and the journals as being incorrigible or fascist or neo-Nazi or totally unverwässrig, it's because I have not allowed my knowledge of history to be tainted by these other books, these other works. I'm fighting. And I'm always taken aback at the laziness of the historians and the indolence and also at the gullibility of the historians. They each believed what each other had said. Until I came forward with my book, Hitler's War, in 1977, published by the Viking Press and by all the great name publishers around the world. And I said, excuse me a minute, but there appears to be no proof that Adolf Hitler knew what was going on in concentration camps or in Auschwitz. There is certainly no proof that he issued an order for it. But I can't even find any proof that he knew what was going on. And the historians became very indignant. They waxed indignant. Both in Germany and in England. And they huffed and they puffed and they said what utter rubbish and what balderdash and how absurd. The Germans would say, Mr. Irving maintained this. And I said, well, it may be, but show me the proof. And along came the Professor X, and he said, I thought Professor Y had it. And I said, Buschardt, I was quoting Buschardt. And Buschardt said, I had it on Hillgruber. Hillgruber said, me, I had it on Jeckelin. I had it on Buschardt. And you find they were all quoting each other. This fantastic edifice just existed all by itself, floating around the countryside like the Goodyear blimp. With a word, well, of course, the word now is Holocaust, written on the side. And it had no visible means of support, apart from the hot air that each historian had breathed into it. So that is the other end of the historical scale. I'm at the real history end, and they are at the hot air end, or what we could call the virtual history end, where it looks as though it's history until you start putting your finger into it, and then you find it's just made, it's all done with mirrors, it's all tricks, they've all quoted each other, and they've managed to get away with it because until now nobody had thought of challenging it. And since my book came out, and since they were found in that embarrassing predicament, in this kind of in this lamentable situation, they were caught with their pants down, literally. Since then, the German government has now made it a criminal offense to challenge what they have maintained. And this is the writing of history reduced ad absurdum. The fact that they have had to entrench and mask and protect and carapace the fabric of lies and fictions and legends and myths, which they call history. They have had to protect it by the most monstrous criminal legislation, making it a criminal offense even to challenge versions of history as propagated by the Nuremberg trials or by people subsequent down the ages. And I'm not going to be so arrogant. Why not? There's nothing wrong with being arrogant. We spend a lot of money teaching our children to be arrogant and ignorant, and in the best public schools to make them arrogant. In this particular case, I'm not going to be so arrogant as to say that I've got it 100% right. It's possible I've got bits and pieces of it wrong. That is what writing history is about. You're constantly refining and improving and getting closer and closer to the actual version of what really happened. You're never going to get actually onto that landing ship, so to speak. You're never going to find out exactly what happened. You're going to approximate to it. But to approximate to it, you have to go to it with a pure mind, without any vested interests, without any preconceived notions, or if you had preconceived notions, you've got to be willing to dismantle them if somebody comes along with a better document than the one you thought you had. I've always said, I have no particular axe to grind on the Holocaust, or on Dresden, or on Churchill, or on Hiroshima, Pearl Harbor, on any of these subjects. I've had no particular axe to grind. If somebody comes along with a document signed by Adolf Hitler proving that he did it, or proving that he knew about it, I will grin sheepishly and say, well, I gave you a good run for your money, but it's now 35 years. It's longer than 35 years now, of course. Since 1945, they've been looking for that document. And to put the icing on the cake, I've been saying, I'll give you $1,000 if you find the document. Come on, it mustn't be difficult. Everyone says it's there. Deborah Lipstadt has told audience after audience that document is there. She even says she has a copy of it in her files. She no longer says that, because I sat in the back of one such audience in Atlanta, where she said that 400 students had been marched in there as part of their compulsory Holocaust lessons, and I said, Mrs. Lipstadt, here's $1,000, and I held up a bundle of notes. Would you like to produce that document to us, or at least tell us where we can find it, and then this money is yours? Because we may say it's a bit tasteless to offer money, but this is the language they understand. It's about money. It's about money on a colossal scale. I have to admit, however, that the fight has not always been fought on level ground, this battle for real history. It has become at times extremely ugly. They have stopped at nothing in their attempts to destroy me. The people whom I describe as the traditional enemies of free speech, or the traditional enemies of the truth. And I don't mean just the Jewish community. When one journalist once asked me whom I described as the traditional enemies of free speech, I said, in reply rather long-windedly, sometimes in the 1990s, the early 1990s, I would awake at 3 in the morning and I would hear the sound of police trucks outside my bedroom window in the centre of London, where I live next to the American Embassy, unloading steel barricades. And I would say to Benty, when she asked what was going on, I would say that means there's going to be another riot tomorrow, which is true. And we would wake up and the building was surrounded by steel barricades because the police had advance warning. Those were hot days. Those were the months in which I found the diaries of Dr. Joseph Goebbels in the Moscow archives. And I didn't find them. I was the first that was able to exploit them and extract them from the KGB archives and bring them back to the West and use them in the Goebbels biography. And the hatred that that one coup, that scoop generated, lasted from that day, 1992, until the present. At one stage, I was telephoned by an officer from Scotland Yard who said, Mr. Irving, may we come and photograph the interior of your apartment, please? I said, I have normally no objections because I regard the police as my friends. And if you just explain to me why you need photographs of the interior of my apartment. And he said, Mr. Irving, we have here in Scotland Yard a contingency room, an emergency contingency room, and in special cases we like to have precise photographs of the interior layout of somebody's building in case we have to come and rescue them. Which a little alarm bell begins to ring in my brain, and I said to the officer, are you trying to tell me something that I ought to know? He said, Mr. Irving, just suffice to say we have intelligence that suggests we need to have these photographs now. So that was the kind of climate that we lived in then, and that atmosphere of hatred has continued to the present day. On a much larger scale, an echo of what happened about 10 years ago, when I used to be in the Daily Mail, the Evening Standard in London every day, every other day, and their favourite page in that newspaper was the Londoner's Diary, a diary kind of gossip column. Very popular, read by everybody in London every evening as they went home on the tube or on the buses. They would turn first to the Londoner's Diary. I was always, every other day, usually the lead story, some other piece of mischief I got up to or some other document I found. And then suddenly nothing used to appear. A new editor had taken over called Stuart Stevens, a very fine editor who happens to be Jewish. And nothing about me at all appeared. And I was telephoned one day by Mark Inglefield, a reporter on that newspaper who had a story and wanted to follow up on me, and I gave it to him. He phoned me later on, he said, yes, it was going to be the lead story the next day, back in the Evening Standard, Londoner's Diary. Nothing appeared at all. And he phoned me in great embarrassment the day after, and he said, David, I feel I owe you some kind of apology, and I just wanted to tell you in private that I have discovered that in the Evening Standard, the editor has issued a circular that your name is never to be mentioned in the newspaper. There's to be complete blackout on your name. And that gives you a little frisson of excitement and a sense of triumph and victory in a kind of perverse way. You have the same feeling, the same thrill of having managed to put your finger in the eye of the enemy that I got when I landed at that airport in Rome on June the 9th, 1992, to speak to university students, and was immediately surrounded by police cars in the plane and put straight on the Lufthansa plane back to Germany. You then say to yourself, good, that's one more country that admits they've got nobody who's capable of debating with me. and that's what it is, of course. You see, this is, for me, what life is about. It's not about assembling huge sums of money or gold with a capital G. I'm not interested in the Jews, to me, because I lived in England at the time the bombing took place, and therefore, somewhere, surely I can go and take money from Volkswagen, or Junkers, or Dornier, or whoever were building the bombs and the planes that did it. I'm not into that kind of game. I don't expect the world to owe me a living. What gives me a thrill, what powers me as a real historian, is the knowledge that I am humiliating the scholars. I am putting egg all over their face, not just by the teaspoonful, but by the ladle. And I'm enjoying every single driblet as it runs down their jaws. So on that highly distasteful note, my introduction to this conference, and
I do most of my work on campus, and I'm trying to encourage the professors to take seriously the ideal of intellectual freedom. Because after all, that's the ideal, that's the essential ideal of the university is people should be able to think and talk about it and think about it. And one of the ideals of professorial class is to teach their students to honor that ideal. In the event, of course, that's not what happens with respect to some subjects, particularly with respect to revisionism. And so one of the things I've been doing for years now, this is like, I was sitting in the back listening to Irving talk, and it's like you get the sophisticated, intelligent, informed view of revisionism. And then I come and I'm going to give you the worm's eye view. It's kind of interesting, but it's very small. I mean, he speaks about really large things, and I speak about really small things. So what I do is I place announcements in student papers with the idea that calling attention to revisionist issues about the Holocaust story, and at the bottom of the announcement, I simply give the address of CotoWeb. COTO is Committee for Open Debate on the Holocaust, and CotoWeb is our site on the internet, on the World Wide Web. The idea being, well, if you run an ad, you run an announcement at a campus newspaper, and it has 10,000 distribution on the campus. There's potentially like 12, 13,000, including faculty, kids who will see the announcement, see these questions about revisionism. They'll go to the web and they'll get some real information. The ads are provocative for the most part. So the new one I have, and there's one of the reasons why I chose to speak on memory tonight. The announcement itself isn't on memory, it's on the Holocaust Studies programs, which I call An Appointment with Hate. And this is the actual ad here, which we're submitting to campus newspapers now. But in it, I feature Elie Wiesel. And you guys actually all know the Elie Wiesel stories, but the students don't. And it occurs to me that students would like to know the Elie Wiesel stories, because all of the students who are in the Holocaust Studies are led directly to Elie Wiesel. And you guys all know, you know the stories about, he told the New York Times in '83 that he was liberated from Dachau, and I'm too neurotic to wear bifocals, so I have and he told the New York Post that he was liberated from Auschwitz, told the New York Times he was liberated from Auschwitz, but the thing is, we all know he was liberated from Buchenwald. And so we find immediately that memory, even on the surface, is more complicated than you think, because some of us remember things that didn't happen. And then we know in All Rivers Run to the Sea, Ellie wrote that he read the Immanuel Kant's Critique of Reason in Yiddish. Well, you know, there's a hitch there because it's never been translated in Yiddish. And so I point this out to the students. We all know these things, right? So we're not interested in them, but the student in Holocaust studies, it may occur to him to ask his professor what the problem is here. There seems to be a problem. And, of course, the famous claim that he repeats, although he did not originate, that at Babi Yar, after some Jews had been killed there, that their graves spurted geysers of blood for months after they were buried. And the student, when he thinks about that, or she might think, well, months, weeks, days. We all know how talented the Jewish people are. But how? Let's try to be sensible. So, and then it has nothing to do with revisionism, but we have in here the claim that he has made on 3 occasions now, recently, only 2 years ago, in the New York Times, that he was struck by a taxi cab on one street in New York City. As a matter of fact, it was on 45th Street, and they picked him up at 44th Street, which is about 210 feet. So I don't know how many of you here play football, but 220 feet, what have we got here? How many yards is that? 70 yards? That's a pretty good punt. I mean, imagine that the teams for the NFL, if they had a guy who could get between the goalposts every time with 70 yards. It would be amazing. So, anyway, we think, and we do the normal things here. We have Elie Wiesel as an eyewitness authority. That was his, and then we back him up with these 4 quotes, and we give the sources for it, so the kids can go and see we know what we're talking about. And then we have the program, the ad is called Holocaust Studies, Appointment with Hate. And so we quote from his book, Appointment with Hate, and it's a famous quote about every Jew should set apart his own healthy virile hate for what the German personifies and for what persists in the German. Well, I mean, it's been around our circles for years, you know. And I mentioned here, the students understand this right away when they see it, but their professors don't appear to, because they teach Elie Wiesel all the time, you know. And so I simply say, listen, just change one word, you know, every Palestinian somewhere in his being should set us apart as of hate, healthy virile hate for what the Jew personifies and for what persists in the Jew, hoping that this would get through the academic community. And maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. It's rather a poor taste to mention this. But anyway, so the ad goes on and ends with, come to our website, where actually we've had hundreds of thousands of visitors now, and see what's going on. You'll find out something about this. And as the literature, the standard literature moves farther away from the gas chambers, it moves into memory. And the Holocaust Studies Department are really dealing largely with memory now. My campus campaign actually reaches students, including editors. We get much more favorable reactions to the advertisements now from editors than we used to. Many editors now come forth and defend the ads not on the basis of revisionist theory, but on the basis of free press. 10 years ago, they wouldn't do that. The professors are very big on memory. All of their work is we move from the gas chambers, we move away from the gas chambers and we get in. They're more and more interested in memory, but the professors, interestingly enough, as a class, always follow the state line. They did it under Stalin, they did it under Mao, they did it under the National Socialists, and they do it now under the Republicans and the Democrats. The professorial class, as a class, is lost, like all other classes of people, and this thing really depends on individuals. But memory, by and large, in this area is political, it's not historical. We really have a political problem, not a historical. There is no historical issue involved on my level of work. It's a political issue. And the politics of the Democrats and the Republicans and this culture is that it's simply against revisionism. It has nothing to do with the facts of the matter. I think that in the long run, what I'm hoping to encourage students to do is to have an open mind, and particularly an open heart and a sense of honor. Thanks.
It's about 9:45 in the evening. And about 30 years ago, 3 months and 18 days, a field marshal pulled up to his headquarters in the evening, and he felt very, very depressed because in his mind he had lost the war for his country. And it's kind of terrible because he had started out that day with high hopes and expectations of, first of all, talking to his leader, Adolf Hitler, and trying to get him to persuade him to understand that he needed a few things in order to defeat the enemy, the Allies. And second of all, he was going to celebrate his wife's birthday. And by the end of the day, like I said, he had thought that he had lost the war for his country. And that's a heavy burden for a great man to have to carry. One thing that the sources all seem to agree about when it comes to Rommel was that he was home. When the Allied invasion took place, he was at home at Herlingen. That was where his house was. It's a small little burg close to the city of Ulm. Now, when it comes to anything else about Rommel, forget it. The sources are so split and so wide. This is when D-Day began. Of course, everybody knows around midnight the airdrops came, and the Allies landed 3 airborne divisions, the 82nd, the 101st in the west, on the Cherbourg Peninsula, and just east of the town of Caen, the British 6th Airborne was landed, and D-Day was in fact starting. There were a number of reports, German reports, of either large masses of radar blips from the few radar stations that were still operating, and also there were some noises reported of ship noises outside the bay. As a matter of fact, a couple of ships' silhouettes had been spotted and reported. And they were getting reports from the Navy that there were some vessels off the Normandy coast, the Calvados coast. So about morning, General Speidel realized that he had a problem. He had to somehow notify Rommel, or some way notify Rommel that the invasion had started. Now, some accounts say that there was 1 phone call. Some accounts say that there were 2. Some accounts say that there was 1 phone call at 6 o'clock, or some say that it was at 10:15, and some that say that there were 2. Again, I did a lot of research on this. I came to the conclusion, this is my own personal conclusion, that there were indeed 2 phone calls. There's enough evidence as far as research, as far as primary resource from interviews, to indicate that there were indeed 2 phone calls. Supposedly, and this is how this is the way I've interpreted this. He came down early in the morning. He was wearing a dressing gown, a red striped dressing gown. Usually he was up by this time. He takes a walk and he's ready to go early in the morning, but this was his wife's birthday. So he was still in his dressing gown and his slippers, and he came downstairs. It was somewhere between 5 o'clock and 6:30, probably somewhere between 6 and 6:15, that the phone rang. He picked it up, and it was General Speidel. He says, "Well, Speidel, what's up?" And Speidel told him that there had been some sort of landings along the Calvados coast, but no one knew how extensive they were yet. They didn't know what type of troops or anything. It was hard to tell whether this was an actual invasion, the invasion, in fact, or whether this was a, and they said Dieppe type, based upon the Dieppe raid of 1943, a Dieppe-style diversionary landing, just as a feint to hide the real invasion. So he didn't know whether it was a real invasion or whether it was just a Dieppe-style raid. And the first thing Rommel barked at him, "We'll find out fast." And Speidel concluded, "Well, Field Marshal, I don't think you should go anywhere yet. Why don't you just hold on and let me find out, and I'll call you back." And Rommel evidently agreed with this. He also told, Speidel also told that he had effected some countermeasures. He told Rommel what he had done, and evidently Rommel approved of what he had done. He said, "That's fine. Let's do this, that, and the other thing as well." So he hung up. And the first thing he did was he went upstairs to his bedroom on the second floor. He got dressed, and then he packed. Lucy saw him. She didn't say anything. She doesn't remember having said anything to him. But she saw that he was upset. She did see that he was upset. His son remembers that in small pieces, bits and pieces of his father discussing the situation. Well, what if they really have landed? What if this is the big one? Well, he was fully dressed now, and he sat and he waited for the second call from Speidel. And the second call came at 10:15. And this was the call that actually, this is where Speidel actually told him the invasion has started. They've landed along the coast. There's a number of major ships in the area, and basically informed him this was a major invasion. Well, Rommel's face got pale. You could see it in his face. And the first thing he said was, I'm coming back immediately. His wife could see that there was something wrong. I mean, she saw him talking, and she saw how upset he was. And before he left, he turned to his wife and he says, "The invasion's begun. I have to leave immediately." They took their farewells behind a closed door, because Rommel's always made a point of not showing emotion in front of the servants or the members of his staff. So he said goodbye to them behind the closed door. Daniel came up to the car, and as soon as they heard the car, Rommel kissed his wife, and he put his hand on his son's head. He said, "Well, Manfred, you and I will try to win the war." You can imagine what was going through his mind at the time. He went home, and the day he goes home, the Allies invade. This happened to him once before when he left Africa. The British started Operation Crusader while he was gone, and he took a lot of heat for that. And now he went home again, and look, there was another invasion. So they drove off in silence, and he sat there, and as he sat there, he had gloves on, and he kept pounding his fist. You can imagine how nervous he was. No matter how fast Daniel was driving, it wasn't fast enough. They stopped in the town of Reims. He stopped there at, it was just a little before 5 o'clock. They went to the city commandant's office, his headquarters. Lang got out, went to his office, picked up the phone and said, "I want to make a state call for Field Marshal Rommel to his headquarters." Well, it was a state call, so they got through a few minutes. And Speidel came on the line. And Lang said, "General Speidel, Field Marshal Rommel." Well, Rommel got on, and they talked for some 12 to 15 minutes. And Lang could tell when Rommel came back in the car, the news was bad. It was bad. Speidel said, "It's a major operation here, but it still doesn't rule out the possibility of a further major enemy invasion somewhere else." One of the things Rommel did was he ordered Speidel to make sure that the 21st Panzer counterattacked immediately. He wanted to know if they had attacked yet. And Speidel said, "No, they're still waiting for reinforcements," and he just hit the roof. He said, "They're supposed to attack. They're to attack immediately. I want the 20th Panzer Regiment in. I want them to attack right now." He ordered the 716th Division, which was on the coast, to immediately regroup its forces and counterattack all along the beaches. He wanted everybody to counterattack until he got back. But he was upset. I mean, he was very upset. And finally, they took off again. And they drove some more. And he said, "You see, Lang, I was right all along. All along. I should have had the Panzer and the 12th SS under my command near the beaches. I should have had them under my command." So they kept going. And finally he pulled into his headquarters. It was 9 o'clock at night. It was a 12-hour trip that they had turned into something like 10 hours and 15 minutes. So they had really, really pushed it. And the first thing they did was they went to the map room. And the map room was actually in the bowels of the mountain. They had blasted it out, and there was a situation room when they went down there. And the first thing that Rommel said when he looked at the map was, "Holy cow, what a mess." And Speidel began to brief him on what happened during the day. And Rommel made a number of calls. As a matter of fact, he would make a number of calls throughout the night. He didn't get any sleep that night. But finally, he looked at everything, and he looked at Speidel, and he said, "Well, if I'd been here, I couldn't have done anything else. So, whatever you've done, the actions you've initiated, I would have done myself." Well, I'm not going to comment on that because I have my own opinions, but I have a funny feeling that things would have been a lot different had he been there. And I read another book by a man named Peter Tsutis. He wrote a book called Disaster at D-Day, and he wrote a hypothetical situation where Rommel didn't go home, and even more than that, actually somehow got the Fuhrer to grant him permission to move the 12th SS up to St. Lô, and they were actually moving up there when the invasion took place. And what a difference one division would have made. A lot of other scholars have said the same thing, that had Rommel been there, the difference might have been actually decisive. So basically, that's the story of one man during one hectic day. And he made one mistake, and that was being home at the wrong time. And because of that, things happened the way they happened.
As David says, I think most people here are familiar with the official version of Heinrich Himmler's death as it has been handed down to us from Allied sources. The story where he was able somehow to keep a vial of cyanide hidden in his mouth for 3 whole days without any of his interrogators ever being able to locate it. They looked everywhere else, according to the sources I've accessed, but they could never seem to lay their finger on it. We're also familiar, I think, with their claims of how they valiantly tried to save his life after he bit into the capsule and made every effort to bring him back and resuscitate him, only to fail. Well, it's a nice little story as far as stories go. But what I've been able to find out after 15 years of research tends to lead me to another conclusion. It's a well-known fact that prominent SS leaders were being assassinated directly after the war, from 1945 through 1948. These assassinations were carried out by different organizations on behalf of different individuals. One organization was DIN, that was composed of Jews who had been partisans and who had survived the dissolution of the Eastern European ghettos. They embarked upon a campaign of assassination of SS leaders. They have claimed to have assassinated some 200 SS officials from the years 1945 to 1948. Now, according to the March-April issue of the Barnes Review, they quote a man named Peter Mason, which is a rather unusual case as well. Peter Mason was an English Jew who claimed to have been commissioned by none other than Winston Churchill in a special squad to go about assassinating German officials after the war. Whether this is true or not, I don't know, but I know that his book has now been published and he's revealing more and more details, but he won't reveal the names of his commanders. And this brings us to Field Marshal Montgomery, because it was his men, his interrogators, his units, which were responsible for the capture and interrogation of Himmler. Now, the records tell us, as Mr. Irving pointed out, there are no records of an interrogation of Heinrich Himmler at the hand of his interrogators in 1945. However, in reading the memoirs of Field Marshal Montgomery, I happened to discover this little statement. Montgomery wrote, "The arrest and interrogation of Himmler is of interest." Well, he says that he was interrogated. Now here is a message which they decoded at the time. On April 28th, just a couple of weeks before Himmler's capture and death, the day after the Allies rejected Himmler's peace offer, Himmler himself had sent a message to SS General Berger to collect together all the SS forces in the South. Berger's reply, decrypted on the 1st of May, stated that the disintegration taking place was on a scale reminiscent of 1918, and insisted on the need to concentrate all German forces in the South under one command. It was followed by yet another message from Himmler, decrypted on the 2nd of May. This pleaded with Berger to collect the SS units militarily under your command and head them yourself. And here's what Himmler wrote, which I think is particularly interesting. He wrote, "Defend the entrance to the Alps for me." Now, there was a lot of talk at the time. The companions who were captured with Himmler, Grothmann and Macher, and Leon de Grelle, who happened to meet Himmler at the time as well, all have written reports about Himmler's talking about some secret mission which he had to undertake at the time. So it's quite clear by these reports, Himmler had no intention of committing suicide. Curiously, though, I have to remark that it was quite a sight, I imagine, when Himmler, Grothmann, and Macher were walking down a street in Bremervörde, and just prior to their arrest. Grothmann and Macher were walking ahead of the Reichsfuhrer. They were wearing big, heavy rubber trench coats, and Macher, of course, who was a war hero, was limping. But behind them was trudging Himmler, and he was barely making it. I mean, and he was dressed very shabbily. They had an odd collection of civilian garments covered by a blue rain jacket. They must have looked an odd sight indeed, but the two men were walking ahead of the older one, and they kept looking back to make sure he hadn't fallen or disappeared somehow. Anyway, it was only a short matter of time before they fell into a trap that had been set for them by the British authorities, who had been scouring the area for 3 men for a full 24 hours. Well, they could have hardly missed them, right? They weren't hiding. They didn't capture Himmler hiding behind a rock or in a barn, or they were walking right in full view, right in the street. Admittedly, Himmler had the patch on and he had the clothes, but I don't find this peculiar at all. The man was trying to get to southern Germany in one piece for whatever he thought his mission was at the time. At any rate, the patrol stopped him, took him into custody. They were brought into a Sergeant Haag. He was sent from this point to a camp known as Westertimke, where Allied POWs had been kept, and now German POWs were being placed there. This was so-called the 031 Civil Interrogation Camp in the vicinity of Barnstedt, just south of Lüneburg. Himmler had been going by the name Sergeant Hitzinger, and his companions were officially booked at 6:30 p.m. on May 23rd, 1945. Himmler had 4 hours left to live. Now, these hours are crucial. Himmler was now going to be searched for the second time. The first time he was searched was with Macher and Grothmann by Sergeant Haag. This time he was going to get a more thorough search, a much more thorough search. Sylvester writes, This I carried out personally, handling each item of clothing as it was removed to my sergeant, who re-examined it. In his jacket, I found a small brass case similar to a cartridge case, which contained a small glass vial. I recognized it for what it was, but asked Himmler what it contained. And he said, "That is my medicine. It cures stomach cramp." Well, so here you have a statement. They found one brass cartridge that was supposedly contained a vial of cyanide. Of course, they never tested it to make sure it was cyanide. That was never done. The other was just an empty case. And I've been trying to figure out why Himmler would have left an empty case there. I mean, if he was trying to conceal the fact that he had cyanide on him, why would he leave the empty case in his pocket to lead to that very suspicion? So that's suspicious to me. He said, Sylvester says, "I found a similar brass case without the vial," and came to the conclusion that the vial was hidden somewhere on the prisoner's person. When all Himmler's clothing had been removed and searched, all the orifices of his body were searched. Also his hair combed, and any likely hiding place examined, but no trace of the vial was found. But at this stage, he was not asked to open his mouth. But he just said, "I searched every orifice of his body." But at this stage, he wasn't asked to open his mouth. Colonel Michael Murphy, Chief of Intelligence of the British Army, under Field Marshal Montgomery, arrived on the scene. And I will tell you that things changed from this point on for Himmler. This time, for the third time, Himmler was strip searched amidst very rough handling and physical abuse, verbal abuse. Chaim Herzog, when he was interviewed by Peter Padfield, briefly described what he saw and heard that night. Here's what he said. Colonel Murphy arrived at about 8 that evening. Keep that in mind, people. Musmano verified it in 1945. Murphy arrived at 8 that evening and had Himmler taken out unceremoniously in a blanket and bundled into his car. According to Herzog, Murphy was using all forms of epithets, including, "Come on, you bastard, we'll teach you." They'll teach him what? Do you know that's the established story? Murphy arrived at 9:45. They took a 7-mile drive over to the Special Interrogation Center, and within 15 minutes, Himmler committed suicide. Here Himmler was kept in custody for over 2 days. He takes a 7-mile ride at 9:45, and he's dead in 15 minutes? No. Murphy left with Himmler at 8 o'clock. Thus, there's a 3-hour lapse between the time Himmler was taken from Sylvester's custody to when he was alleged to have committed suicide 3 hours later. What went on during those 3 hours? In any event, Himmler had arrived in an escort of 3 vehicles when he got there. The first person to exit the vehicle was Colonel Murphy, followed by the stooped and bent-over figure of the former Reichsfuhrer SS, ignominiously dressed only in a nightshirt and wrapped about with a woolen blanket, conjuring up a Christ-like image presented before Herod just prior to crucifixion. It was a pathetic sight. Himmler just clad in a blanket and all stooped and hunched over. Well, apparently Himmler, at this point, was searched again. Now keep in mind, he's undergone 5 complete searches, every orifice, but of course they never think to look in his mouth, they never think to ask, you know. That's always avoided. Always. Well, according to Padfield, when Himmler allegedly bit into the cyanide capsule, he was jumped by Austin and Murphy, who upended him on the floor, held his feet high, while Wells gripped his throat. Now, I've seen many photographs of Himmler's body. Much different. Different angles, different shots. I've seen what appears to be blood on his head. I've seen what appears to be ligature marks around his neck, a bruise along the side of his face. You never see the back of Himmler's head either. And I challenge anybody to dig up as many pictures as you can of Himmler's body. You will not see any of the back of his head either. I can very well believe that Himmler was jumped by Austin and Murphy and that someone was strangling him. But not in order to save his life, for God's sake. At any rate, Himmler died. That much we know for certain. And now we're going to get to the autopsy. Well, we all know why autopsies are conducted, right, people? They're conducted to determine the cause of death, right? Guess what? I've got his autopsy report. There's not one word in here that gives the cause of death. Not one. There's plenty about his anus and his sexual organs and their condition, but there's nothing about his cause of death. Not one test was conducted to determine the cause of death. And it's right here. You know, it's claimed that Himmler died as a result of cyanide, yet numerous photos taken of Himmler at the time, we've seen them, there are no signs of cyanosis present. How do I know this? Because I've studied it. I like to read. I located a book on forensic medicine called Homicide Investigation. And here's what they say. Cyanide, whether taken internally or inhaled in the form of a gas, kills a person by interfering with the body's utilization of oxygen carried by the blood. Consequently, death is a form of asphyxia. In addition, when alkali cyanides are taken internally, there are evidences of corrosion of the lips, tongue, throat, and stomach. In cases of acute poisoning, the symptoms which develop very rapidly are chiefly dizziness, palpitation, intense air hunger, cyanosis, i.e., a very dark blue color of the skin, and unconsciousness. Violent convulsions may develop. The hands are usually clenched. Death nearly always takes place very rapidly. However, if there happens to have been food in the stomach at the time the cyanide was taken, these symptoms may be considerably delayed. Delayed, people. They'll still be present. They'll just be delayed. But here's the external appearance of a person who dies from ingestion of cyanide. Externally, now you've seen Himmler's corpse for yourselves. The most characteristic features are the open, staring eyes with dilated pupil, frothing at the mouth, bright red or purple patches on various parts of the body. Did any of you see that? I didn't. But you know what? Hermann Goering's corpse has those features. Perhaps many of you here have seen the photo taken of the Reich Marshal after his suicide by cyanide. I recall that one author, obviously uninformed as to the appearance of a corpse poisoned by cyanide, remarked that Goering's half-opened eyelids reminded him of winking. But that is one of the classic symptoms of cyanide poisoning, that half-open eyelid. Himmler didn't have it, did he? Himmler's fists weren't clenched. Mm-mm. Well, the way I think Himmler died, I'm going to tell you. I think that he was beaten, and he was beaten so hard and so viciously about the head that it caused a rupture inside of his head. And that led to his death. And one final thing. The person who performed the autopsy excised Himmler's brain and portions of his skull. This is a fact. We don't know what happened to it, but I'll tell you something. I have a good idea how Himmler died, and I hope you all do today as well. Thank you, Ann, for all your patience.
I'm living in Hollywood. I'm a writer, and I have a meeting at Paramount. And the secretary there, she's reading something that I wrote about the Billionaire Boys Club. And she tells me, I like it, it reminds me of my family. I say, the Billionaire Boys Club, your family? And the secretary says, yes, all those murders. My mother, Lola, was at Auschwitz. I say, oh. Secretary says, and after that, my mother commanded a prison full of Nazis. I say, what? A few days later, Hollywood, the Moustache Cafe, spinach crepe. I'm having spinach crepe. I'm having dinner with Lola. Elegant woman, coral lipstick, black eyeliner that goes like this, you know, like on a femme fatale. She speaks 5 languages fluently. She's 66 years old. And Lola starts telling me her story. She tells me that at the end of World War II, she commanded a prison in Gleiwitz, Germany. She says the inmates were German soldiers, but she says some were Nazis, even SS, pretending to be German soldiers. Now, it's 1989, Poland is still communist, but I get into Lola's prison, into the prisoner's cell. I tell them, Dzień dobry, good morning, I'm visiting. I see the prison records. Remember when, according to Lola, she went to the Polish government and said, I want revenge, okay. I find Lola's application in Lola's own handwriting. She writes, I want to cooperate against our German oppressors. I find the official document appointing her commandant in Gleiwitz. And after that, I go to Germany 11 more times, to Poland 3 more times, to France, Austria, Italy, Canada, all around the United States. I talk to 200 people in, with interpreters, in Polish and Russian, Danish and Swedish, German and Dutch, French and Spanish, Yiddish and Hebrew. I left out English. I get 300 hours of tape-recorded interviews, and I see thousands of documents. And what do I learn? Well, Lola was telling the truth. She was the commandant in Gleiwitz, and she was taking revenge. She slapped the Germans around. And just as she said, she stopped. I remember one day in 1989, I was having lunch with one of her guards at the Hotel Lejny, reading Wiener Schnitzel, and out of the blue the man says, you know, Lola stopped. She told us stop. She said, we're going to show the Germans we're not like them. So Lola was telling the truth, but she wasn't telling the whole truth. Lola had told me the people in her prison were German soldiers, and yeah, 20 of them were. They were German soldiers working as painters, as carpenters. But there were 1,000 other prisoners there, and they were German civilians, German men, German women, German children. One prisoner was a 14-year-old boy. He had been out in Gleiwitz wearing his Boy Scout pants. Someone cried out, you're wearing black pants, you're a fascist. And the man chased the boy and tackled him at the Church of St. Peter and Paul and took him to Lola's prison. The boy was completely innocent. So were most of the people in Lola's prison. They weren't Gestapo, they weren't SS, they weren't even Nazis. Of 1,000 prisoners in Lola's prison, 20, just 20, were ever even accused of it. But the Germans in Lola's prison were slapped and whipped. And I'm sorry to have to say it, but they were tortured. The Boy Scout, the guards poured gasoline on his curly black hair and set it on fire. The boy went insane. The men, they were beaten with a Totschläger, a beater to death. It's a long steel spring, and at the end is a big lead ball, and you use it like a racquetball racket. Your arm, your wrist, and the spring, they deliver a triple hit to a German's face. Now, Lola didn't tell me, but the Germans in her prison were dying. I found their death certificates in Gleiwitz City Hall. One of Lola's guards told me, yeah, the Germans would die. He told me I'd put the bodies on a horse-drawn cart, I'd cover them with potato peels so no one would see. I'd ride to the outskirts, and after I threw the potato peels out, I'd take the Germans to the Catholic cemetery to the mass grave. We all know about Auschwitz, but I have to tell you, the Germans in Lola's prison were worse off than Lola was at Auschwitz. Lola at Auschwitz wasn't locked up in a room night and day. She wasn't tortured night after night. She herself had told me, thank God, nobody tried to rape us, the Germans weren't allowed to, but all of that happened to German girls at Lola's prison in Gleiwitz. Now, the Office of State Security was a Polish government organization. The lower ranks were Polish Catholics, but most of the leaders were Polish Jews. The chief of the office in Warsaw was a Jew. When I was in Poland, he wasn't alive, but I met some of his family. The department directors, or almost all of them, were Jews. In the province where Lola was, Silesia, in Silesia, the director of the Office of State Security was a Jew. I met him in Copenhagen, a little bald-headed man. Didn't know that I'd be a little bald-headed man 10 years later. The director of prisons was a Jew. I met his whole family. The Secretary of State Security was a Jew. I met him time and again at his home in New Jersey. And in Silesia in 1945, 3/4 of the officers, now not the GIs, not the guards, but the lieutenants, the captains, the officers, 1/4 of them were Catholics and 3/4 were Jews. I interviewed 24. And I learned that the Office of State Security ran 227 prisons like Lola's, prisons for German civilians. This one camp, I found the death certificates for 1,583 Germans. In other camps, other prisons, thousands of German civilians died. German men, women, children, babies. At one camp, there was a barracks for 50 babies. They were in cribs, but the camp doctor, he was a Jew, he was from Auschwitz, Dr. Sidorowski. He didn't heat the barracks, he didn't give the babies milk, he gave them soup, and 48 of the 50 babies died. All in all, 60,000 to 80,000 Germans died. Now, some were killed by Jews, some by Catholics, many by typhus, dysentery, starvation, but all 60,000 to 80,000 died in the custody of the Office of State Security. And it all had been covered up for almost 50 years. Jews who did it didn't talk about it. For example, the chief of police in Breslau, Germany, in 1945 was a Jew. He wrote a book about the Holocaust, and at the end of the book he says, what he says about being chief of police in Breslau is, quote, "We move westward to Breslau and from there to Prague." That's it. Jewish reporters who knew about it didn't write about it. There's a working reporter right now in New York City. He was in Poland right after World War II. He tells me, whatever the Germans tell you, believe me, it's true. But he himself never wrote about it. The truth was covered up and was still being covered up. In 1989, I go to Jerusalem to Yad Vashem. Now, as you know, they have 50 million documents there about the Holocaust. And I asked them, well, what do you have on the Office of State Security? They have nothing. I asked, well, what do you have about Jews in the Office of State Security? Nothing. I said, well, there were Jewish commandants, Jewish directors, and they say, the chairman of Yad Vashem says, it sounds rather imaginary. And the director of archives says to me, impossible, impossible. Denial, denial. That's what the Jews in the Office of State Security have taught us. That's what I tried to write, what I did write in An Eye for an Eye. The very first words of the dedication for all who died and for all who, because of this story, might live.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd now like to move right into my reason for being here tonight. I'd like to make a contribution to our understanding of what really happened and why, courtesy of Professor Christopher Browning. For example, on Mr. Irving's website can be found an article written by Robert Race. It's a review of the Path to Genocide published in 1995. Race demonstrated that Browning has not presented any documentary evidence for his contention that there was a German government policy specifically enacting what Browning and others referred to as the final solution to the Jewish question in the sense of killing. This phrase, the final solution, appears in the titles of all 4 of Browning's books, but documentary reference to the phrase in the German documents is itself rather scarce. In the context of mass murder, it cannot be said to exist at all, with one exception, and that would be the Huss confession at in Krakow, Poland in 1946. That was an interrogation, and I wouldn't put too much weight on that testimony. I'm sure you people are aware with the interrogations of Rudolf Hess that come out of Auschwitz. At any rate, there's nothing in the text of that book, which came out in 1995, nothing in the footnotes, nothing to confirm that this abstract entity existed, the final solution, as a killing program. The term Endlösung, final solution, did of course appear in 5 or 6 German government documents during the war. Certainly in 4 inter-office memoranda, as well as the Wannsee Conference Protocol of January 8, 1942. And I won't question the actual authenticity of any of these documents. I'll just look at their context and content and validate them, or pass judgment on them. The first is a letter from Heydrich to Ribbentrop dated June 24, 1940. Secondly, there's the Göring Decree, it's called, of July 31st, 1941. The Wannsee Protocol of January 8, 1942. And a directive written by Franz Rademacher of the German Foreign Office, Section D3, on February 10, 1942. There's also the Schlegelberger Memorandum, which Mr. Irving spoke of yesterday, and I'm sure he'll mention that again throughout the course of this weekend. The first document is a suggestion that Ribbentrop participate in discussions on the Jewish question, and this one was dated 1940, specifically mentioning a territorial Endlösung, the territorial solution, which would have to be found. And the meaning of this proposed territorial solution in 1940 is disclosed in the documents which follow, because they're all, one follows the other chronologically. Browning doesn't bother mentioning this memo in his writings. He does write this on page 15 of his book, Faithful Months. On page 15 of the book, we read that a policy of emigration had been encouraged by Hitler to 1941, and that, quote, in short, Nazi Jewish policy until 1941 does not support the thesis of a long-held fixed intention to murder the Jews of Europe, unquote. So that kind of cancels the supposed criminality of the 1940 document. Document number 2, which was Nuremberg document PS 710, the Göring Decree of 1941, was a supplement to the earlier directive of January 24, 1939, which discussed the solution of the Jewish question through emigration and expulsion. Heydrich, the head of the security service, had been further commissioned to show Göring that both organizational, factual, and material measures already taken for the intended final solution of the Jewish question. On page 21 of Fateful Months, Browning writes, the significance of this document is open to debate, and mentions the thesis of Martin Brojat that it was a comprehensive program for the deportation of the Jews to Russia. So he basically tells us himself that that isn't proof of the final solution as described as killing. In his Foreign Office study of 1978, which incidentally may have been commissioned as a response to Mr. Irving's 1977 book, having appeared alongside the Fleming book, Hitler and the Final Solution, Browning wrote that certainly in October, neither Luther nor Rademacher of the Foreign Office had any idea that this new final solution meant the deportation of Jews from the various countries in Europe. Meant here is deportation to the east, let alone a plan to murder. And he writes that a week after Luther's meeting with Heydrich, and I quote, Luther was still thinking in terms of deporting Jews from Europe, which was in line with the underlying principles of the Madagascar plan, unquote. So there's nothing in the files which indicates a murderous plan. In his witness statement of 1999, Browning wrote, "This was not an order for the final solution," and no comprehensive draft for a final solution is among the surviving German documents found after the war. I will presume that this statement applies to the Wannsee Protocol as well. On Wannsee, document 3, we read the following in Professor Browning's witness statement of this year. The evacuations were to be regarded solely as temporary measures, for practical experiences were already being gathered that would be of significance for the imminent final solution. Heydrich went on to explain just what he meant by this. The Jews would be utilized for labor in the East. He also writes that the protocol merely cryptically noted, finally, there was a discussion of various types of possible solutions. On page 79 of Browning's 1978 book, he wrote that, once again with regard to Auschwitz, he wrote, quote, "The evacuation to the east had now replaced emigration as a further solutional possibility," unquote, which confirms the change in policy which the previously mentioned documents hinted at. If we hold Professor Browning to his statement about no comprehensive draft for the final solution having survived the war, then we can assume that the Wannsee Protocol is not the blueprint for an overall plan to murder European Jewry that has been ascribed to it by the traditional historians. This despite his citation of Eichmann in 1978. Browning wrote that the solutional possibilities discussed at the conclusion of the conference were described by Eichmann in his interrogations as killing possibilities. He does not mention Eichmann's statement in 1999, and there's a reason for that, I think. Professor Browning wrote some embarrassing references to Eichmann in his 1978 study. I don't think he regards him as a credible witness these days. But more on Eichmann in a moment. The point is there's nothing in the documents themselves. Document 4, the Rademacher Memorandum to Bielefeld of the North African Colonial Department. He would have been concerned about the Madagascar solution that was discussed. Well, this document was written on February 10th, 1942, and it may be the key to the entire series of documents I mentioned, and it's the last time the final solution was mentioned in the documents. I'll quote Browning on this on page 79 of the Foreign Office book. The war with the Soviet Union had placed other territories at the disposal of the final solution. Therefore, the Führer has decided that the Jews should be deported not to Madagascar, but to the east. Madagascar thus no longer needs to be provided for the final solution. I say this is the key document because clearly the Madagascar plan had also been regarded as a final solution. It's right there in the text. And it's obvious that killing was never part of that plan. So there it is, an absence of a plan to murder, confirmation of a plan to deport to the east. And, of course, there's the Schlegelberg document as well. So there's no comprehensive proof of the implementation of the presumed Hitler order of a final solution in the traditional sense in the German government documents. In conclusion, I think my study of Christopher Browning is a very clear indication that the exterminationists can be seen to seek out documents which appear to confirm their thesis. Obvious forgeries, documents which support an opposite thesis, and ambiguous texts are the stuff of which this history is compiled. One can only conclude that the state of the evidence is good for revisionism. The evidence presented by Christopher Browning in his books, articles, and expert witness statements is also a windfall for revisionism. Thank you.
The same thing applies in many respects to judges. I've never heard a ringing declaration on the part of any Canadian judge on behalf of free speech. They're sort of discreet about the thing. And, you know, I think again of the First Amendment in the United States and Oliver Wendell Holmes, people like that. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, freedom of speech involves the right to think the unthinkable, discuss the unmentionable, and challenge the unchallengeable. And that is my idea also of free speech. Judge Robert Warren. Judge Robert Warren said, I think it was in 1991, but anyway, not too long ago, suppression of speech, even where it has little value and great costs, amounts to government thought control. And I can say amen to that. How did the hate laws come about in Canada? Well, in 1965, there were 4 pimply-faced youths running around in Toronto, scrawling swastikas and rude signs on walls. And this led, believe it or not, to the passing of the hate laws in Canada. The Canadian Jewish Congress had for many years been agitating for such laws, but this gave them an opportunity to lobby more effectively, I suppose. And after many years, in 1971, the hate laws were passed. And it was interesting, I was in the press gallery at the time in Ottawa, and it was interesting to see how the MPs voted. There were at that time 252 members of Parliament in Canada, and 89 voted for the hate laws, 45 were opposed, and 118 true North cowards didn't vote at all. So really, we have the hate laws in Canada, under which many people have been prosecuted, as a result of a minority of MPs voting for them. And what they say in the hate laws is this: it is an offence punishable by up to 2 years in prison and fines for, quote, writing, putting up signs, or knowingly engaging in any other public action that promotes hatred against an identifiable group. There is a bit of a catch-22 there too, as far as the politically correct are concerned. They have to prove there's someone knowingly engaged in this sort of thing. And that, of course, has made it a little difficult in court for charges to be substantiated. But in any case, I can tell you this, that many American editors, I could name a few, many American editors would be in jail in Canada, or heavily fined, or whatever. I can think of the editors of Spotlight, Inspiration, Truth at Last, that sort of thing. They wouldn't be in operation in the true North. It gets to be ridiculous at times. A couple of years ago, the play show, the musical Showboat, was to be presented in Toronto, and there was a complaint, an official complaint to the police and so on, that this was a racist show, and therefore it was hate literature. And before that, there was a Shriners convention in Toronto, and some kids or young people were running around with signs saying "Yankee go home," and these actually led to charges under the hate law. What happened, of course, was that the charges in the end were dropped, but nevertheless they were subjected, the people concerned were subjected to considerable harassment. Between 1974 and 1994, there were 44 cases reported in the media as being subject of examination under the hate laws. And the whole purpose of that sort of thing, of course, is harassment and intimidation. It's really quite an incredible thing, but as I will explain later, even worse than the hate laws are the Human Rights Commissions. Human Rights Commissions were set up in the early 1970s in order to establish fairness in employment and in housing and so on and so forth. And I was working for the Vancouver Sun at the time, and I predicted that this would lead to something much more serious than housing and employment. We had a Human Rights Commissioner appointed by the first socialist government in British Columbia in 1972, who actually was going around to forest companies and telling their presidents that they weren't employing enough men with beards. Yeah, they weren't employing enough men with beards. I don't know what the presidents of these companies said, but that shows you how ridiculous this sort of thing is. And it wasn't long, of course, before they moved from that into the free speech zone. And they have now become absolute monsters in Canada, particularly in British Columbia. And of course, you have to take into consideration the people they select to be on these commissions. We've got in British Columbia Mary Wu Sims, who is one of Canada's leading lesbians. And the chief of the Human Rights Commission in Ontario is a homosexual. You know, I mean, that's the kind of, these are the kinds of people who get into these things. You have to be politically correct in a big way to get on these commissions. I mean, they would never appoint anybody like me to one of these commissions. You know, I'll now come to my own case, which has become, I suppose, the most famous or infamous, depending on your point of view. In 1993, the Kill Collins Act, as it became known, was passed in British Columbia. And here are a few things that law does, as described by the lawyer for the British Columbia Press Council. These are the points, or some of the main points that he put forward. First of all, the right to free speech, and this is not the lawyer, this is a fact, the right to free speech was removed from the Human Rights Act. I mean, that is indisputable. Truth under the Human Rights Act is no defense. Doesn't matter whether you can prove something is right or not, it is no defense. It depends on whether you're indicating discrimination against someone or are likely to bring someone into hatred or contempt. Within the framework of the Act, there is no appeal. You can go, as I am going, to court to ask for a judicial review of the law, but of course that's a very expensive business, and not many people would be in a position to do it. No, I'm not in a position to do it, except that I'm getting some very good help from Mr. Doug Christie of the Canadian Free Speech League. Publication in the public interest is no defense. Artistic, academic, and scientific work is no defense. Reports of public meetings are not defensible on grounds of privilege. Adjudicators in these human rights tribunals that they appoint are judge, jury, and prosecutor. Legal aid is available to everyone who wants to complain, but legal aid is not available to all of the people who are being complained about. For instance, if a newspaper is prosecuted under this law, there's no point in asking for legal aid because, first of all, they probably wouldn't want it, and secondly, they can't prove that they're paupers. And what happened, you know, it's interesting, Bill Gates, the richest man in the world, if he were living in British Columbia and issued a complaint on the grounds of the Human Rights Code, he would be entitled to legal aid. The costs are not recoverable. You can't, we spent, that is, the North Shore News spent $203,000 for a 5-week hearing in the first tribunal to which I was subjected, and the North Shore News was subjected. But even though the charge had to be thrown out, the fact is you'd lost $203,000, which is a considerable threat to any publisher in the province. They're going to think twice about saying things that the politically correct and the government don't want to be said. So what we have in British Columbia is a heresy act. a man called Harcourt was the Premier of British Columbia, socialist, when the amendment to the Human Rights Act under which I was prosecuted was written. And what he said was this: we can have liberty as long as it doesn't offend anyone. A man called Evans, who was the agriculture minister still in British Columbia, said when the debate was going on in the legislature, and I will say it was a very bitter debate, lasted a whole week, but it was rammed through in the end by the majority. This man Evans said, we need this legislation because the courts don't always do what we want them to do. You see, I mean, this is the standard of intelligence and so on the part of these people. And the Rights Commission lawyer, one of them anyway, they had a whole battery of lawyers at my first hearing and so on, said, with regard to the federal hate laws, the criminal standard of proof makes enforcement of hate laws difficult. So what they did, of course, was say, in effect, that they wanted their own laws because if they went before a proper court, they couldn't get the prosecutions or the charges upheld. So they passed their own law with all that stuff with likely, might, and indicate in it. And, you know, in 1994, I started my little trip to perdition, I suppose, because I wrote a column called Hollywood Propaganda. And in that column, I called Schindler's List Swindler's List. And the reason I called it Swindler's List was that the man's own wife had described him as a swindler. Anyway, this was absolutely shocking to some people. And here is the column, Hollywood Propaganda. And what I said, I'm not going to read the whole thing out, but what I said is this, in some of it. Prophecy is risky, but today I prophesy that the Steven Spielberg movie Schindler's List will run away with the Academy Awards. I make that forecast without having seen it and without having any intention of doing so, since it must be the 555th movie or TV program on the Holocaust. 50 years after the war, one tires of hate literature in the form of films. And I said, Swindler's List will hit the Academy bell because Hollywood is Hollywood, and what happened to the Jews during the Second World War is not only the longest lasting, but also the most effective propaganda exercise ever. You'll note that I don't say that the Holocaust itself was propaganda. I say that this propaganda emanates in a flood from Hollywood. I said hardly a day goes by but that press, radio, and television don't mention something about the 6 million. The figure is nonsense, but media folk go on parroting what everybody, quote, knows, unquote. I used to do the same. That's the safe way, too, for as a recent article in Vanity Fair magazine put it, if you question the official version, you can expect trouble. But that's an understatement. You will be damned as anti-Semitic, racist, and even nasty. After half a century of this, the moguls of the movie world reckoned the time was right to cash in a big way. And Spielberg reckoned it was time for him to cash in too. And I go on to say that critics have fallen on it, especially in the US, where many of them work for Jewish-owned media and know how to adjust their safety belts. Others simply reflect what they have been programmed to reflect. And I said at the end, am I suggesting that Hitler wasn't Hitler, or that hundreds of thousands of Jews didn't die in the camps and elsewhere, as did many non-Jews? No, but propaganda is selective, and Hollywood propaganda is the most selective of all. And so that really sent the Canadian Jewish Congress and the Nye-Brith and all the rest of them round the bend. And what happened was that the Canadian Jewish Congress spokesman said that Collins has gone too far this time, and we're considering, we're pondering legal action against him. And so I wrote another column in which I said, well, pondering is far better than pandering, and I have no intention of pandering to the Canadian Jewish Congress or to anyone else. And
Ladies and gentlemen, the latest edition of Smith's report indicates, now these are not my words, but please let me quote it to you. The most productive revisionist researcher of the 90s has been without any doubt the Italian Carlo Matonio. I'm going to show at least and present 40 points. This will be the bulk of the Carlo Matonio report of his activities. Carlo Matonio points out that it was January the 27th, in 1945, that the Soviet soldiers of the 60th Army from the Ukrainian front entered Auschwitz. 27th January 1945. There are a lot of investigating commissions going on there, active between February and March of 1945, and they confiscated huge, huge quantities of documents abandoned by the Auschwitz SS. And among those abandoned documents were these Zentralbauleitung documents, the Central Building Administration documents. Ladies and gentlemen, why did the German SS abandon these documents instead of destroying them? In the German SS bureaucracy, the documentations are not the personal property of its director. The documents are the property of the state, and therefore only the supreme commanders could decide the fate of the various groups of documents. And from the numerous files which Carlo Matonio has found in the Soviet military archives of Prague, the documents classified as Geheimsache, Geheimreichssache, secret documents, belonging to Einsatzgruppe 7, for example, of Organization Todt, those were destroyed specifically at the end of January 1945 on superior orders. Superior orders. There was a Vernichtungsprotocol drafted and detailed a list of all the documents that were to be destroyed, and they were. Now at Auschwitz, the order to destroy the archives of the Zentralbauleitung would have had to come from the chief of Amtsgruppe C of the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt. They had the authority over all the Auschwitz projects. It was obvious that if, as Prisak or others might continue on, if there had been this extermination program, then the pertinent documentation would have certainly been classified Geheimreichssache, secret. And in that case, the head of Amtsgruppe C would certainly have given an order to destroy those documents. But be that as it may, it remains that the documents were not destroyed. But the explanation which Jean-Claude Prisak gives us is, as we say, naive to say the least. The most obvious conclusion, and here's your point number one, the very important question is that the Supreme SS authorities considered the Auschwitz Zentralbauleitungen irrelevant and inoffensive, and furthermore, says Matonio, the contents of those archives fully confirms that conclusion. With great consciousness, Carlo Matonio affirms that he did not find any document from which it can result that at Auschwitz there was any project for, or that there was in operation, the extermination of human beings in homicidal gas chambers, period. There are also several documents that Matonio has found describing from June 1943 onward that there were enormous medical and hospital facilities that were being prepared for the Auschwitz complex. These were being scheduled in Bauabschnitt 3, the construction phase 3, that is, in Birkenau. These huge medical hospital facilities were to have 111 Krankenbaracken. That's 111 barracks just for the care of sick prisoners. 111 barracks just for sick prisoners. Und 12 Baracken für Schwerkranke. That's 12 barracks exclusively for the care of the very sick prisoners. Well, isn't there some incompatibility in the creation of a huge health and hospital facility just a few hundred yards away from 4 crematoria where, according to the official history, people were being exterminated on a large scale? Figure that out. As Carl Matonia indicates, he has documents about the population of the camp proving that there were many prisoners who were officially classified as nicht einsatzfähige Häftlinge, prisoners unqualified to be placed as laborers. Under this general classification, he has documents also of prisoners classified as stationäre Kranke, stationäre Kranke, inpatients, also Invaliden, disabled patients. They would have been absolutely the very first victims of this alleged homicidal gas chamber action. But what does Carlo Matonio's real history, to borrow a timely David Irving phrase, have to say about these? Well, they actually show a very interesting pattern. The numbers of the prisoners who were unable to work did not decline. They remained steady, not dropping, even increasing, reaching at sometimes unexpected levels. For example, fact, 14.4% of the total prison population of the Birkenau male camp were unable to work category during the month of February of 1944. And 39.5% of the total female prisoner camp were in that unable to work category. They had an unable to work category in this extermination camp, ladies and gentlemen. And this was at the beginning of 1944. The documents Carlo Matonio has are proof of it. And then you heard on the film when Ernst Sunder was talking to me about Entlassungen. This is a very important point. Civilian workers, lots of them, were imprisoned right there in Birkenau, the so-called extermination center. They were in there for a few days or a few weeks for minor infractions such as violating some work regulations. For example, there's one documentary file that contains no less than 135 of these releases that were taking place between June 1943 and December 1944. And this is data only partial, but again, we can ask ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, since a lot of releases, can they be reconciled with a mass extermination thesis? Since all these released people would have resulted in a lot of other witnesses to this alleged homicidal gas chamber action going on in Auschwitz? Let's look at the real history of the situation in Auschwitz in the month of August of 1945, in the month of August of 1942. What do we see? Well, we see that in August of 1942, due to the sadly noted typhus epidemics, the mortality among the prisoners was very, very high. For example, in the men's sector alone, these sick men were dying off at the rate of over 300 a day. The mortality reached its highest daily figure on the date of 18 August 1942. There were almost 400 men. There were 390 men who died on that day alone. As a matter of fact, in the men's sector, during the first 19 days of that month of August 1942, there were 4,113 deaths. That's an average of 216 deaths per day, or the equivalent of 29% of the average male inmate population, which at that time was 23,000 prisoners. I would merely like to add that he has, as an announcement, let's call this point 40 in lieu of that because of the time, he is having this particular book published in the Japanese. What occurred was this book found itself into Japan, my band Holocaust Interview, and the Japanese were impressed with it, and we have an offer to turn it into the Japanese. So I thought I would make that as an announcement. It's the first announcement of it at the very first of these meetings, and it's my pleasure. And I want to thank you so kindly, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention. Very kind of you.
To start with, I would like to quote a Jewish researcher doing research in Jerusalem named Sarah Rembiszewski, who was doing in 94-95 research about the political background of my person, trying to discover what a weird, wicked German I am, a right-wing extremist, an anti-Semite, and so on, and to expose me as a bad guy. She didn't bother about discussing my scientific research she's done, but she posed a very important question in that she asked, how come that a young German chemist, with the best result he can have at school and at university, having a career in front of him, a very promising one, that he sacrifices everything and gets a revisionist? How come? I learned about the Holocaust at school 3 times. I changed school and so forth, and so it came about that I've been taught 3 times the Holocaust lesson, resulting in nothing special. I mean, it's quite normal. I believed in everything, and I believed especially that all the people who doubt, who even deny, that they are, as we are told, neo-Nazis, right-wing extremists, maybe mentally insane, and all that sort of stuff, and you know what I'm talking about. And I was convinced, yeah, that's correct, and it's absolutely correct to prosecute them, because they want to whitewash Hitler, they want to reinstall a Third Reich or a totalitarian regime. I don't want that, so let's fight them. That was my position, until I got 25 years old, studying chemistry. And then I started being interested in German history. My father himself was expelled after the war from Silesia, and I got interested in that, and I learned about the Holocaust against the Germans after the war, the Eastern Germans, where 2 to 3 million perished. What John Sack was talking about yesterday, these 60,000 who died in prisoner camps, and that was just a tiny little bit of the Holocaust that was going on there. We're talking of a sum of between 2 and 3 million here. I got interested in that, and I learned my mother survived in the rural area the bombings. And there's another Holocaust that was committed against the Germans, where 100,000 perished. And my mother's father survived Allied extermination camps. I call them that way. The extermination camps that were built up by the Canadian and US, Americans, and partly by the French after the war, in the famous or unfamous Rheinwiesen. My mother's father survived that one. So I can say, well, I'm a kid of 2 families of Holocaust survivors. Completely different Holocaust. But I was interested in it. In 1989, a friend gave me a book of Paul Ressigny, the father of revisionism. A Frenchman, not a German, before the war, communist or socialist, member in the French resistance to fight against the Nazis, not with the Nazis, got into a camp, was an inmate in concentration camps. He was not a perpetrator, but a victim of what you in general might say is the Holocaust, all the perpetration, or the persecution of all minorities, and you could include the resistance fighters in them as well. He was in concentration camps. And nevertheless, after the war, he was, from a scientific point of view, the founder of revisionism. And the arguments he brought forward made me think, not because, my knowledge about history was dreadful, I couldn't judge what he was talking about, but there was a chap that I could say he's not having any political agenda, he's not having any political intention, he doesn't want to whitewash somebody. And then I could allow myself to listen, just to listen, to allow doubts to appear. Nothing worry, that's an historical topic. I cannot solve it. I'm not an historian. I have no idea. It might raise doubt, but I'm not going to get involved in it. That's the responsibility of the historian. Let them do it. And that was it then for me. But anyway, it raised doubts. And at the same time, when I raised doubt, I noticed, well, aren't those who doubt or deny it, aren't they neo-Nazis, right-wing extremists, idiots, cranks, and mentally insane? So am I now that sort of guy? I don't want to be that. And you had to feel, it was an automatic sort of emotional reaction, because I doubted. I thought, I'm now a bad guy, and if you're a bad guy and you don't want to be it, you feel guilty for what you're doing. And I immediately, because I was doubting, I felt guilty. And I think, well, what's that? It cannot be true. When I expressed these doubts, and my concern that I wanted to have the right to doubt, and if the German state doesn't allow it, I always already felt then I might get in trouble with criminal law in Germany, just because I was doubting. And this German constitution doesn't allow me to doubt, then it cannot be a democratic, a good constitution. I said that to my father, and the only reaction of my father was, leave my house and never return again. It didn't stop me from doubting, because, I mean, threats don't change anything. Doubts, you get rid of them either way by convincing arguments, not by threats. Just at that moment, I had finished my diploma degree in Germany, and that's the point in your life as a chemist, I would say, when you have the broadest knowledge, when you then afterwards go for a PhD. PhD are all these people who are being educated to be idiots. They just look into one topic, and they're specialists in there, and they forget more or less the surroundings. And just at the end of your diploma degree, you have the broadest knowledge, and not even then, I knew what Zyklon B was. I mean, certainly I heard the name, and that's these compound with which they killed millions, but I didn't know what it is chemically. I had to go to a dictionary to find out. And that was the position when I said, all right, the first encountering of revisionism was a historical one, was Rossinier, and I said, that's the responsibility of historians. I can't do it, let them do it. And here we had a chemical argument, and I was a chemist. I couldn't do it. That's the responsibility of chemists. Let them do it. Wait a moment, I'm the chemist. Who else if not me? I had my doubts. I didn't know any longer where is good and where is bad, because the good guys, they define themselves, and I've heard it from German politicians, as long, I think it was Philipp Jenninger once, the president of the German parliament, as long as we do the opposite of Auschwitz, we do well. You can say, well, that's more or less the way German politicians are acting, are being expected to act from the world. And that is how you define good nowadays. That was what I felt. But I think, right, these are the guys who do the opposite of Auschwitz. Now it turns out Auschwitz might have not been what we were told, and that the good ones are lying. In the worst case. They might simply be wrong because they don't know better. I mean, I have been running around for 25 years telling people it's true, and prosecute the people. I was not lying, I simply didn't know. Didn't know any better. So, there I was, and I had to consider that the evil might have been not that evil, and that the good might have been not really good when they are indeed lying. Somebody must have lied, I thought. At least somebody. That's not good, that's evil. And I was really confused in those times, and I thought, I have to find out for myself, to be really sure for myself what to do, where is good, where is bad, and how do I have to act in my life. So I said, all right, let's have a look into it. That's where it started. Yes, having said that, what have I done? I tried to finish my PhD. I withdrew it. I didn't, because I didn't want it to die. I tried to find somebody in England to accept it, but I had to need the support of my supervisor. He was definitely not supportive. So I couldn't get this support. I don't want to go into details. And at the end I thought, well, you have to earn your daily income, and I thought the only option that remains is become a professional revisionist, a publisher and editor. That's what I'm doing, having set up a publishing house, publishing a quarterly journal, and more books. Have done it in German only, but we're going to get it in English as well. You know, Ignaz Bubis, the former head of the German Jews, wanted, by any means, the Max Planck Institute force to stop me, what I'm doing. If only they wouldn't have done that. I had my career. Now I am forced to be 24 hours a day a revisionist because I cannot survive in doing anything else. Everything's gone. No chance but doing revisionism professionally. That's what I'm doing.
As many of you probably know that I'm a great fan of the criminal judge of the Waffen-SS, Dr. Konrad Morgan, whose duty it was to prosecute crimes that took place in the concentration camps during the war, which, of course, there's no movie about, and none pending that I know of. Dr. Morgan had mentioned that he surrendered to the 7th Army, or portions of the 7th Army and also the 3rd Army when they divided Germany up. And so I was looking at the National Archives through the 7th Army records to see if I could find something. So I was going through the big list on all these things, and I noticed a line that said Dachau Massacre. So I thought maybe there was some big massacre that the Nazis did or something like that. And so I asked them to pull the file, and they did. And when I looked at it, then I realized that it was the long-lost official report of the U.S. Army on the massacre of German prisoners which took place at Dachau. And I could really hardly believe my eyes because according to the rumors that had floated around, the copies were supposed to have been destroyed. And but it turns out it was a copy made by the investigative U.S. detective who was in charge of investigating the case. At the end of the war, when the Germans were almost beat to pieces and had almost nothing left, 2 U.S. divisions were racing through Germany to get to the city of Dachau. Anyway, what happened was both of these divisions reached the Dachau concentration camp at almost the same time. The 45th entered into the concentration camp through the rail line in the southwest corner. Shortly after they got there and moved into the concentration camp, the 42nd Division showed up. Portions of the 42nd saw the same railroad track, went in, and turned in a different direction on the inside. As it turns out, both elements of the 45th and the 42nd Division were investigated for war crimes because both of them executed prisoners. At the point when the 45th Division arrived at the train, 4 Germans came out to surrender. They raised their hands to surrender, and they were promptly executed by the U.S. troops and killed right on the spot. Actually, they were wounded, and then another GI from the 45th Division went in and gave them the finishing shots and shot them in the head, got rid of them. So that was the first 4. At that point, the members of the 45th Division talked among themselves, and many of the guys there remembered people talking, no prisoners, we're going to kill everybody we run into. What happened was they then penetrated the Dachau concentration camp and followed the railroad line and turned left where they saw a hospital. Okay, now the hospital was promptly invaded by the U.S. forces, who grabbed everybody from the hospital and examined them to see whether they were Waffen-SS. Okay, which of course many of you probably know, Waffen-SS soldiers, most of them had tattoos specifying a blood type, and so they could be identified by lifting up their arms and seeing if they had a tattoo. So everybody with the tattoo mark who was identified as a Waffen-SS soldier, wounded and everything else, was dragged out of the hospital and brought to an open area with a high wall. It's sort of like a coal yard near the railroad tracks. The lieutenant in charge that gets the blame for shooting the prisoners there is a fellow, an Indian soldier in the U.S. Army named Lieutenant Bushyhead. Have many of you heard of his name? Okay, Bushyhead gets most of the credit for, coming up with sort of a vague plan of revenge. But actually, it was Bushyhead was a 2nd lieutenant. His commanding officer was a 1st Lieutenant John Walsh, who was actually his commander when they moved into the concentration camp, and it was his idea, really. He ordered Bushyhead and the German prisoners into the coal yard. They lined them all up against the wall, and Walsh grabbed a fellow from another section, another squad in the 45th Division, who didn't actually want to be there either, and grabbed him with a machine gun and said, "Here, you put this here." Now, what happened was that Bushyhead said that it was understood they were going to kill everybody against the wall. And he said this in his testimony, okay? Bushyhead said that it was just understood, and he knew when they were lining them up they were going to let them have it. The machine gunner didn't want to be there, okay? And the really crazy one was Lieutenant Walsh, who was lining up the U.S. soldiers at the time to kill everybody. Some of the Germans saw the Americans lining up a machine gun and started getting kind of nervous, which would be a good thing to get. The line up against the wall started moving to the side. People started getting antsy and moving. And then one of the U.S. soldiers says, "Look, they're trying to escape they opened up a fire on the men with a machine gun. And this is a good part. I'm always pleased in stories of atrocity. You find sparks of kindness or sparks of willingness to actually abide by laws that are decent. At this point, the commander of the 45th Division section, his name was Colonel Sparks, and I'm sure you've heard of him. Sparks heard the machine gun and the rifle fire open up, realized that they'd just put a bunch of prisoners against the wall there. Sparks, the commander, came in and kicked the guy off of the machine gun and made everybody stop firing. Okay? Luckily for the Germans, a chunk of them had immediately dived to the ground when the fire opened up. Okay? So that in the pictures you may have seen, I have a chunk of pictures here, where there's 3 fellows standing, I think one fellow standing like this, and another guy is standing like this. I guess he didn't feel like raising his hands or anything. And then there's a pile of people in front. The witnesses said that fortunately, many of the guys who were on the ground had dived there to escape. I mean, why stand in front of a wall if you're going to have guys shooting at you? And what happened was, in the hustle and bustle, some of the German guards, or doctors from the hospital, evidently rushed in, grabbed whoever they could, and pulled them away when Sparks interrupted the shooting, and brought them back to the hospital. So what happened to the 42nd Division was this. The 42nd Division saw the railroad cars. Everybody was all upset because all the people starving, and in bad shape. They turned right at the railroad tracks and went into another section of the camp where the main door to the concentration camp was. When they arrived there, a German officer and a Red Cross representative and some other people were there to meet him, and they had a white flag of surrender. The SS man and the Red Cross fellow turned the camp over and surrendered it to the Americans. And then the American account, this part does not show up in the interrogation of the U.S. soldiers. This is from auxiliary stuff that's come out since then. The Americans say that the German officer who surrendered the place, and they call him Lieutenant Skudzinski or something, but I think they made the name up or got it wrong, because there's no record of an SS officer named Skudzinski that I could find in Washington, D.C. They have a whole roster of everybody who was an SS officer. Well, as you might expect, the SS officer who surrendered the place with no fight tried to escape, and they had to shoot him. Okay, so people who came in the front door of the place found 3 more German corpses in front of the place, and one of them had his head smashed. The other 2 were killed by rifle fire, evidently. And right next to the guy who had his head smashed, they found a Army rifle, U.S. Army rifle, that was broken in half. So you can figure out what happened to him from that. Elements of the 42nd Division continued along the main road into the camp, where they came to the watchtowers. Now, the watchtowers by this time had white flags, and they're high towers. You've probably seen some pictures of them. There were guards up in them. One of the towers, by this time, by the way, the prisoners in the camp knew that the Americans had there and were going about hog wild. You can understand their joy to get the heck out of the place. The prisoners surged forward into an electric wire, and a chunk of the prisoners were electrocuted and killed on the spot. The Germans in the tower, one of them who managed a machine gun, shot or opened up, not on the prisoners. There's no record of any prisoners, but evidently he fired warning shots above the heads of the prisoners to keep them calm. And at that point, the U.S. Army soldiers ran forward to the tower and demanded the prisoners get out. They were pretty rough. The Germans surrendered to them. They were they were lined up in several columns, and then the U.S. opened fire on them and killed everybody in the whole group. A chunk of the German soldiers fell into the canal and were washed downstream. That's why to this day they don't actually know how many people were killed. Some of the U.S. soldiers said that there were approximately like 15 to 17 soldiers that were killed, and some of them floated down the canal. Okay, now there are photographs of about 5 or 6 Germans who were dead and just lay on the grass near the edge of the canal. Okay, now the prisoners further went wild. They said that they identified more Nazi guys in the crowd. There's reports that some of the Germans had dressed in prisoner uniforms, but they were identified by the Dachau prisoners. I don't know whether that's so or whether they were really capos or, part of the camp administration who served underneath the Germans. I don't know, because some of the people were ripped limb from limb and trampled to death, and we don't know how many people that happened to. There was another case where a U.S. soldier was standing there with his rifle at guard, and some inmates came and grabbed the rifle off of him and shot some people in the area. And anyway, that's basically pretty much, outside of some other isolated instances. One soldier in the 45th Division said that he didn't think it was right to kill unarmed people who were surrendering. And he said that he was standing there in the camp, and around the corner of a building ran a German soldier chased by another U.S. soldier, and the U.S. soldier shot the German in the back, and he fell over dead. The U.S. soldier who had mentioned the case said that he told the guy, he says, "You're crazy going around shooting people like this," and the guy didn't pay any attention and went off. Okay, now, that basically sums up the wild times when the U.S. invaded the place. Troops from the 45th and the 42nd Division participated in executing prisoners who had surrendered, who weren't doing anything. Okay, the intent of the prisoners was known by the white flags. None of the Germans resisted or fired on any of the U.S. soldiers. There's no confirmed report that any of them ever fired at any of the Americans. They just wanted to surrender. In fact, that's what their orders were. What did the detective recommend? Okay, he recommended that Lieutenant Bushyhead, he recommended that Lieutenant Walsh, a tech sergeant who was at the tower, and the fellow who finished off the guys at the railroad car be charged with murder. Okay, with murder. The report was forwarded to Patton. Patton said, "I'm not charging any of these guys," and he ordered that the photographs, the report, be burned and gotten rid of. And that's what happened. Nobody was charged with anything. Okay, so everybody who shot prisoners went free, and nobody was prosecuted at all.